So the US is currently negotiating with key allies in the G7 to form a coalition that would provide up to $52 billion in aid to Ukraine, as well as ongoing support. Now, this substantial financial support would be funded by the profits from Russian assets that have been frozen and are accumulating interest, primarily in Europe. Currently, Russia has about $280 billion in blocked assets in G7 and EU nations. This $52 billion figure comes from calculating interest gains on Russia's frozen assets over the next 20 years of between $2 to $3.5 billion annually that would go to paying back the money to the G7 rather than to Russia. The original plan was just to provide Ukraine with 3.5-ish billion per year to help Ukraine, but the US is pushing for a more aggressive route. Instead of trickling the interest to Ukraine, they would use the forward future interest that would go to Russia as a guarantee for a G7 loan of $52 billion. Now, the only way this works is by keeping Russia's $280 billion in assets frozen for 20 years, and the interest continues to go to the G7 loan rather than to Russia. Now, the G7 discussions are being led by the US and involve obviously other G7 nations like the United Kingdom, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan, as well as EU representation, with the hopes of reaching an agreement at the G7 summit in Italy this coming June. However, achieving consensus has been challenging and may take several more months as Germany and some EU nations remain hesitant in holding all of that money for so long. The EU is not required here, but their buy-in helps. Currently, many of the funds are held in Belgium, who has signaled they are on board as well. Now, the dissent among some nations reflects broader concerns about security risks associated with these assets, including potential European exposure to Russian economic and physical retaliation, something the US isn't really exposed to, as we rely very little on Russia economically. Now, the US strategy is focused on quickly maximizing the support available to Ukraine by leveraging the profits from these assets rather than, as I said, just kind of trickling them across to Ukraine. Now, in the same vein, the U.S. Congress has passed the Rebuilding Economic Prosperity and Opportunities for Ukrainians Act, also known as REPO, which President Biden signed into law on April 24th. The bill allows the president to confiscate Russian sovereign assets that are subject to the jurisdiction of the United States for the purposes of supporting Ukraine. The law requires that all frozen Russian sovereign assets remain frozen until hostilities between Russia and Ukraine have ended and Russia has fully compensated Ukraine or is participating in an international mechanism that will do so. The law will also limit the president's power, meaning he can't lift sanctions already imposed, and this is meant to keep a new administration from removing sanctions because they are more friendly to our adversaries. The law also requires that the administration determine and report to Congress the location of Russian sovereign assets. Now, with regard to the U.S. REPO Act, there may be some court battles here, as the Constitution requires due process under the Fifth Amendment before assets can be seized. Now, there's a difference between assets being frozen and assets being seized. Russia's assets are currently frozen. The minute they are reallocated to Ukraine, they have been seized. So does Russia have a Fifth Amendment right to due process before having their property taken and reallocated without some sort of judicial hearing? Well, the Supreme Court has previously ruled that persons do not include foreign states in contract and finance law. However, other previous Supreme Court case law has shown that under the Bill of Rights, nations and corporations are persons in criminal cases. So they might be in these kind of financial case law scenarios. The other angle here, though, is this could just fall under the constitutionally allowed sanctions regime, which are a punitive measure and do not require judicial review. Nonetheless, this is only required for the repo funds that the U.S. is talking about, that the U.S. controls, and is not required for the potential G7 funding. It is also worth noting that under the REPO Act, these assets won't be used for war funding. They will be to support reconstruction, rebuilding, and recovery efforts in Ukraine, as well as provide economic and humanitarian assistance to the people of Ukraine. With that being said, obviously such funds would free up Ukraine from the cost of their own recovery and allow for them to focus more on funding the war against Russia. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has indicated that this is a collaborative effort within the G7 aiming for a united front rather than isolated individual actions by specific countries. The G7 proposal and the REPO Act clearly seek to protect the Allied support for Ukraine from political uncertainties in the U.S. and Europe, especially with the upcoming U.S. elections that could influence what type of aid, what type of sanctions, etc., continues to be born out of the United States in support of Ukraine and against Russia. Now, the inventory of Russian assets is being completed as we speak, and it looks like this will be coming online relatively quickly. We'll just have to see what the G7 says in their meeting in Italy in June.